I used to watch a lot of cowboy films with my grandma when I was young. We would sit on the sofa, and actually, the reason I find this funny is because she was such a quiet and timid woman, and she would watch these crazy cowboy films all of the time.
Hello, I'm Ali Pitts, and this is a Russian and Soviet movie podcast. For this special episode of the show, I'm interviewing musician and composer Juliet Merchant. At the time of recording, 6 of the silent films Juliet has written scores for are available on the streaming service Klassiki. To get a 30-day free trial of Klassiki, please go to klassiki.online/a Russian Soviet movie podcast. That's a Russian Soviet movie podcast, no spaces. I'll put the link in the show notes. Also, if you use the code RUPOD50, that's RUPOD50, you can get 50% off an annual subscription. Okay, here's my interview with Juliet. Today I am talking to the composer Juliet Merchant. Hi Juliet, thank you for joining me on the show. I've been wanting to talk to you for years and finally it's happening, so welcome.
Hello, it's very, very nice to speak to you as well. I know we've had this coming up for a while, so it's a pleasure to be here. Absolute pleasure.
The diaries have finally aligned.
They
Yes.
have, indeed.
So the reason I thought you'd be a fabulous, fantastic guest is that you have written 6 scores for Russian and or Soviet films over the years. So tell us about those. How did you get into that? Let's start there.
So it was actually very interesting because I was in Russia when I met an editor who then came back to work in London, and he knew my work. Actually, our first film was neither Russian or Soviet. It was actually a Western documentary about the Russian prima ballerina for the English National Ballet called Natalia Osipova. And that was with director Jerry Fox. And that was sort of my first ever film that I did, and that was in 2019. It was all very exciting. And we had the premiere at the Curzon, which was wonderful. And from then, it was through that my now boss, Justine Waddle, who was producing that, then got me into then Kino Classica, now Klassiki. They renamed the company. And that's how I started doing silent film, which was really, really cool and completely unexpected.
Wonderful. Okay, so many points we could jump off from there, but let's start with, so you said you met this contact who you worked with for the first score in Russia. Could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up being there?
Yes, of course. So it was my year abroad. I spent half of my year in a town called Yaroslavl, which is east of the Moscow province, and the second half of the year in Kazan, which is in the province of Tatarstan. More sort of slightly more central and south in Russia. And it was one of the most fascinating years of my life, to completely immerse yourself in an extremely different culture, and to have to change your, at that time I was 21 years old, to have to shift it to cope and understand such completely different perspectives and to see beauty in them and to also analyze them and see sort of what works for me, what doesn't, what do I like, what I don't, and understand this entirely new world and to be able to function within it, to sort of change all of your instincts and to understand a new philosophy of life. I absolutely love Russian philosophy of life and of living with soul, living with heart, living with passion. It feels much more real, I suppose. I know that's quite a vague thing to say because we're all very real. But I found with the conversations I had with Russian people, they always went deep very quickly. We always had an honest and sincere opinion from someone that described their own authenticity. And I just learned so much more. And you create such deeper bonds with people. And there's such sensitivity to be had there too. Essentially, I loved it. And it is such a tragedy for everyone involved that there, of course, is a war at the moment. I think it is just awful, but I won't go down that road.
Sure, of course. I feel very similarly. As you may know, listeners will certainly, if they're a long-time listener to this show, will know I spent a number of years there, and it sounds like our experiences quite a lot of commonality in terms of that intensity and like emotional directness and perhaps like rejection of small talk.
Yes.
and willing to get into like quite deep topics quite quickly, which is interesting because there's such this stereotype of Russians as being very closed off, and there is definitely a truth to that. Like,
yes.
I often heard it described as like metro face, which is like London tube face, only more so.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, when that kind of like sort of impassive or whatever facade, which developed probably for very understandable historical reasons, when someone's decided, okay, you're worth taking a chance on or trusting or opening up to, yeah, people can be incredibly open. And absolutely, yeah, what's happening now because of the regime in that country is just so tragic. I mean, first and foremost, clearly for Ukrainians, because we're just minding their own business, trying to be their own independent country, and as you said, probably best not going into, but it's important on a show called A Russian and Soviet Movie Podcast. I don't think it can be overemphasized how we feel about the present just appalling situation. Okay, so and also, as you mentioned, Yaroslavl, I got to visit there for a few days while I was living there, and just a beautiful city, and it
definitely
maybe
That's
I will share some
cool.
photos on the socials for the show when I get around to it. But I never made it out as far as Kazan. So can you spare a few moments to tell me about your impressions? Oh, that's a very Russian turn of phrase.
So Kazan has a population of both Christian and Muslim peoples, and it's a very fascinating city to live in because of that reason. They have managed to create such a beautiful harmony, which, in the West, sort of this Christian and Muslim divide has created so many problems. So it was really wonderful to see this harmony in Tatarstan. It's kind of like a whole new world. It's really hard to describe when you put those together, because of course they merge as well, and you get those two beautiful cultures in one. It's very hard to describe, but Kazan is great. Kazan is a whole lot of fun. It's a bigger city than Yaroslavl. People, I think, are super friendly. There's lots going on, sort of a bigger high street. Lots of beautiful, huge buildings, as there are in Russia. It sort of creates this liminal space where you're just sort of in this expanse of a place all of a sudden. Do you know what I mean? You know, for example, when you're in the tiny villages in the countryside and you'll see all these little huts, these cute little cottages, and then there'll just be a gigantic glowing golden church, and you're like, how how did this get here? So what I'm talking about is the giant church in Kazan, which is like unfathomably beautiful, which I would definitely go to see. But just another thought on the Russian language in terms of, you know, thinking about sound in the podcast. I think people are under the assumption that the Russian language is very harsh, but maybe this is just from movies or something like this, because I would find the Russian language very poetic. It's a very soft and almost like a great voice for storytelling and for children in this way. I find the Russian language very soft.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I think part of that Western perception of it does indeed come from movies. And I mean, much like English, and probably any language, how harsh it sounds depends on what you're doing with it. You know, if you're a Chekist, like barking orders to your subordinates to go and round somebody up, then it sounds pretty intimidating. Or you know, you're a Bond villain or whatever. But yes, absolutely, there is a beautiful musicality to it. And sorry, I'm going to get distracted by my English teaching background, but I remember hearing that one of the things that it has in common with English is that it's called a stress-timed language, I think, which English also is, and because of that, it works well for rap music. So because where you put the emphasis. I'm explaining this really bad, but yeah, Russian rap music sounds just as good as English language rap music. It's one of those surprising things where you go, I don't think that would work, and then you hear it. Actually, there's a bit at the end of what's his name, Kirill Serebrenikov's movie Petrov's Flu. The end credits are this like Russian gangster rap song that's incredibly dark, but because of the nature of that film, it works so well, and it sounds just ominous and and spooky and scary, and it's just like cinema as a composite art where all of these different kinds of visual and sonic expression melding together to create this there's a German term for this that I can't remember, but this kind of composite work of art that just has this incredible impression on the viewer / listener. Anyway, going off on that one.
No, very interesting.
But also, to jump on another tangent here, just talking about stereotypes and perceptions, Western perceptions of Russian and or Soviet people, I love that one of the films that you scored is The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. So, Juliet, please tell us a little bit about what that film is for anyone listening who hasn't seen that one yet.
That is actually such a wonderful film in terms of deconstructing the Western perception. So Mr. West goes to the land of the Bolsheviks, aka the USSR, and upon his arrival, he gets taken in by a group of bandits who are obsessed with gold and America and wanting to exploit him, basically. and he goes off on all of these adventures, as it were, to sort of help the bandits unknowingly. Mr. West probably should have had a slightly better summary of before going to the USSR, but unfortunately not. Until at the end, to give a spoiler, he gets picked up by real Russians who say, please don't think these bandits are what Russian people are like. Come with me, let me show you real Moscow. And we go on a tour around Russia, and we see the real thing, and we see the kindness of the Russians and the honesty of the Russians, and that they're not these sort of scallywag bandits obsessed with extorting vulnerable tourists.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful summary. Thank you.
You're about to hear the track The Police Chase from Juliet's score for The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. We didn't mention it in the interview, but this film was directed by Lev Kuleshov. That's right, he of the famous Kuleshov effect. So if you've never seen one of his films, Mr. West is a great place to start. If you're looking for something a bit grimmer and grittier, his later film, By the Law, is stunning and well worth seeking out too.
So, along with Mr. West, we have this sidekick, Jeddy the cowboy, who is an important part of the film and the stuff he gets up to. So having this cowboy character in there as well, how did that inform your approach to creating the soundtrack for that one?
Well, so actually this is a bit of a tangent, but I used to watch a lot of cowboy films with my grandma when I was young. We would sit on the sofa, and actually the reason I find this funny is because she was such a quiet and timid woman, and she would watch these crazy cowboy films all of the time. But so I think I was quite influenced by my time with her in that regard, in terms of this upbeat but very energetic energy. And it was actually quite a challenge because there's a chase scene, and I remember it goes on for about 10 minutes in the carriage. I believe it's the authorities that are chasing them all the way through the town, and they have so many near misses. And to keep up a tension scene that doesn't have extreme visual changes for over 10 minutes is actually quite challenging. So musically, you have to make it much more interesting, and you have to make the changes within the music and kind of be much more sensitive to visual changes. So, for example, in a modern film, you'd have big explosions or big crashes or big changes, but this is a chase scene all through the city, and it keeps going and going and going. And in terms of cowboy music, I would say I have tried to adhere to that kind of style through sort of violins and lots of drum action, and just kind of how I pictured that from black and white cowboy movies that I watched with my grandma. But it was really, really fun to make, and quite a challenge musically, to find the low points and the high points in order to kind of do tension release in this way.
I just love that for a change, we as a Western audience are getting to see ourselves through the eyes of another culture, because it's so usual for us to see, mainly from Hollywood movies. Here in Britain, that's probably a lot of what we watch, but even when we're watching British movies that have non-British people in it, it's often very stereotyped. So it is, for me anyway, so fun to see another culture doing an exaggerated version of Westerners. I love it.
Definitely. And especially because there was still a sentiment that was quite common whilst I was in Russia of, oh, well, the West just doesn't like Russia. I'm like, that is such a shame to think that still it exists today. And that was, before obviously the war happened. And yeah, I think we should make another Mr. West and re-clarify what Russia actually is. It's not just Putin on a bear drinking vodka, actually. It's much more than that. Much, much more.
Absolutely. And I feel like, again, to get into slightly political territory, like one of his great, heavy scare quotes here, but successes had been to kind of convince a lot of Westerners that him and Russia are synonymous, and Russians are like him, like grim and authoritarian and just scary and weird. Whereas,
that's so true. Yes, I agree.
My ex-students, they the vast majority, they were just lovely, open, curious, wonderful people. Their response to me as a Westerner being in Moscow was just slight puzzlement. It would be like, why would you be here when you could be not here? And their own perception of their country as being like, I'm putting words in their mouth here, but like chaotic and and backward, and it's like that's not untrue, but also don't see the West through rose-tinted glasses. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad I live in a somewhat functioning democracy.
Yes.
So I don't want to draw a false equivalence, but like, yeah, we've had like a really rough last 15-20 years or so in the UK since the financial crisis. And to be honest, if you're not well off, it's been, or you come from a town that was devastated by deindustrialization, it's never been good in your living memory. So it's kind of like, I think the stereotype that I sometimes encountered in Russia was that like all Westerners are wealthy and well off and just have all this nice stuff, and it's like, no, we have vicious inequality where we're from.
Yes.
And I don't know where to go from that, but in terms of talking about films, but in terms of stereotype, it's so interesting how easy it is to misunderstand places when you haven't had the chance to spend a decent chunk of time there. And then I'm also conscious that being able to do that is a huge privilege that I had, and that proportionally not many people get to have. So,
But I was going to say there are, lots of examples of inequality in the silent films. For example, I believe, please tell me if I'm wrong, The Girl with the Hatbox, it has those rich people who are sort of around the table, having their sort of secret, probably wealthy off of the black market, meals that are super luxurious. And then in Aelita, I mean, we're talking about a queen who tries to overcome her overlords and to help create equality with the workers and give them rights and liberate them. And then House on the Volcano is all about inequality, and how powerful people are within the authorities, and how that means that the workers do not get a say and do not get any rights. And if they do say anything, then really bad things are going to happen.
absolutely. And that is something that, in terms of that depiction of poverty, certainly in Girl with a Hatbox and Aelita in the then contemporary Soviet Union, was just quite surprising to me, because my stereotype would have been that this being like a Soviet film funded by the authorities, the regime, that it would airbrush out all of the rough edges of society. And certainly probably once you got into the 1930s and the beginnings of high Stalinism, that's probably what you would get. I haven't actually seen that many 1930s films, so I can't comment for certain, but my understanding of like when socialist realism came in as the official style, that's kind of how it went. But yeah, so interesting that there is that grit under the fingernails of that. Can we talk a little bit about those three films? I think I'd like to start with Girl with a Hatbox. One could semi-characterize it as an early Soviet sort of rom-com.
Yes, I would say that's very accurate. And this beautiful girl who's making hats in this shop that is owned by very corrupt people who are very rude and very mean and selfish and want to serve themselves and their community, eventually get taken down by, well, these girls, two suitors, if I'm remembering correctly. And it is a rom-com, and it's lovely and it's sad, and it's pre-intense censorship, so I think it actually serves more as a warning or even like communist propaganda, in the terms of like, oh, look how awful these people are, and look how wonderful a life you can have if you're not a corrupt human being. I think it's more of the message there. But musically I remember it very well, because you had to keep changing between, I had sort of three themes in my head: the evil theme of the characters who are doing so much corruption, the love theme, which is actually quite passionate and loving and quite sad as well, because ultimately at the end one of the suitors is rejected, and also it's quite a light and upbeat film. It's quite cute. It's about a young girl, and especially at the start when she is with her father, he's older, and she's in what looks like a dacha, and it's all snowy and beautiful. It's a very heartwarming film that's just
so beautiful,
lovely and very beautiful to watch, and kind of depicts again the realness of the Russians that we were talking about, the sensitivity, the sweetness, of sincerity in that manner, and really contrasts it with selfishness and how crude that self-serving, I suppose the thieves you could call it, are, which I find really interesting to see, and the kind of moral ending of the people who decide to live that lifestyle, and how they end very badly, and they get found out and they get the sort of comeuppance, as it were.
Definitely. And it definitely has that kind of like rooting for the underdog spirit that you'll see in 1930s like Great Depression era American Hollywood cinema. It's just that this is silent and the context is different, but there's definitely like commonality. So I think if one liked a film like, say, It Happened One Night, this is a kind of weird Soviet predecessor of that, to me anyway.
Yeah.
There's even stuff where, I don't know if you've seen It Happened One Night, but there's even like a plot point similarity in where you have the two of the romantic leads having to sleep in the same room, and there being like a sensitivity about this.
Yes, I love that part. And there's a scene also where she thinks there's a mouse, and she's like teasing him and going, oh my god, I think there's a mouse, and she knows there isn't a mouse, and he has to run all over the room, and she just watches how much he loves her. I think it's very fairy tale like, which is lovely.
This next piece of music is Natasha and Grandpa from Juliet's Girl with a Hatbox score. This film stars Anna Sten, who was originally from Kiev. After Girl with Hatbox, she made a film called The White Eagle, directed by Yakov Protazanov, who made Aelita, Queen of Mars, which we'll be talking about shortly. Sten then left the USSR, making a Dostoevsky adaptation in Germany, before moving to Hollywood and signing with MGM.
There's another film that I was going to bring up called Hello, It's Me, which is obviously much later, and is actually USSR in Armenia, actually. But it also has this sort of fairy tale like love in it that's very visual, it's very beautiful, it's very poetic. And yeah, there's just a lovely scene in that where they're on this old sort of rickety, broken, I suppose, carousel, I think is what it's called, or merry-go-round.
I guess so. I was literally thinking about this film the other day and was trying to
Really?
look it up to figure out what
Ah,
kind of fairground ride that was, because it's just a
yeah,
beautiful sequence, and I'm so
yeah,
glad you brought that film up because it's
yeah.
so underseen, and
Yes, I
hooray for
agree.
Klassiki for making that available to a wider audience. And it's a
Absolutely.
60s Soviet film that is widescreen, and there's not a lot of those. Uh,
Yes,
so
that's true. Yeah.
I've come to love the non-widescreen formats, the more like Academy ratio, or close to that equivalent that they used in a lot of Soviet cinema. It like saying it has to be a widescreen to be good is just nonsense. But there it is.
Yeah,
It works really well in Hello, It's Me. I'm so glad you brought that beautiful film up. So
definitely.
definitely, dear listener, go over to Klassiki, watch that film. It's beautiful, and it has Margarita Tereshova, I think, who goes on to be in Tarkovsky's Mirror as the protagonist. If she's a protagonist, do you have protagonists in Mirror? Maybe not. I'm distracting myself, but anyway, yeah. If you want to see her in, I think her first film role, she's in that, and yes, what a beautiful film. Sorry, I I
That's
jacked that. Where were
okay.
we? Uh,
That's okay. The score actually for Hello, It's Me is written by Martin Vardazarian, who I actually met when I was in Armenia, and he's a really wonderful guy, fantastic musician, mainly in jazz, but he's also scored other films that I would highly recommend checking out as well.
Oh, amazing. And you've been to Armenia as well. That's definitely on my bucket list.
Highly, highly recommend. Yerevan is one of the most beautiful places. You know, it is so safe in Yerevan. I live in London.
Mm.
You can leave your phone on a table in Yerevan and no one will take it. The only person who will take it will maybe be the shopkeeper who will go, "Oh, someone's left their phone. Let me just take that in for them." That's
Mm.
it. Can you imagine in London before you even breathed? It would be
That
gone.
would be
But
gone,
anyway.
and it would be sold on, and it would be like the equivalent of those kind of like new economic policy folks that we see in
Yeah. Yes.
in Mr.
Yes.
West and
Absolutely.
in Girl with a Hatbox, because they're just out for themselves. Or
Absolutely.
actually, to maybe be fairer, people are just being trained by the kind of the ruthlessness of our society of like, just be out for yourselves and I don't know, don't care about other people. I don't know, maybe I'm just excusing really poor behavior there. But yeah, anyway, I'm so glad you brought up that film, and I definitely will have to check out more films scored by that composer. Sorry, could you repeat his name?
Yes, of course. It is Martin Vardazarian.
Martin Vardazarian. Wonderful. Okay. So talking about Armenia, then, that would bring us on to another film that you have scored that possibly out of the six is maybe the least known, and that would be House on a Volcano. Again, just so underseen. So tell us a little bit about that one.
So, this is probably one of my favorite films. And, oh gosh, where to even start? Um, it's such a powerful film. I have cried multiple times at multiple different screenings whilst watching this, even though I have watched this film gosh, so many times. I know exactly what's going to happen. I completely understand it. It was something that can sometimes be quite interesting is that in different screenings sometimes the translation changes a little bit, and I kind of maybe understand different nuances and different meanings through that. But House on the Volcano, to give a brief summary, is about workers who are working on an oil rig. And essentially they realize that it's extremely dangerous to be working on, because there is gas coming out of the ground. There is a village nearby that this would affect very badly. They go to the authorities and say, hey, we can't continue working on here, it's extremely dangerous, and there could be a serious incident if we continue working. Of course, they're ignored because there is money to be found. Lots and lots of money that the authorities want. So they keep on digging. There's protests. There's talks that don't go anywhere or don't happen. Things get more serious. And it essentially ends up with this gas leaking into a nearby village. And setting everything on fire, and lots of people die. And did you know, in the film, the fires are actually real? They actually set the set on fire, which I think is mental. But anyway, and of course lots of people died, not in real life, even though they did set the set on fire. Which ultimately leads to a revolution of the workers, and this again is squashed by hanging the main people of this revolt. And it all is bracketed by one of the workers essentially telling this story as his memory, because in much later life, his son then wants to become a part of the Communist Society, I believe. And he wants to let his children know what happened in his youth and the inequality that happened, essentially.
That's a wonderful summary. Thank you, Juliet. And just to give a shorthand, dear listener, if you haven't seen this film yet, I would almost characterize it visually as somewhere between Man with the Movie Camera in terms of its visuals, but story-wise, it's got a lot of similarities to Battleship Potemkin, but it's less operatic and stylized than that. So, and I think is probably a more effective film for it, because Battleship Potemkin, you really feel like you're watching propaganda. I mean, with House on a Volcano, there is definitely an agenda to this film. Like, the before the revolution was really bad and we don't want to go back to it, but it just does it in a more naturalistic way. And just in terms of the visuals, the reason I compare it with Dziga Vertov and Man with the Movie Camera is just the spectacular capture of industrial landscapes and really striking camera angles, and we see men climbing oil derricks in just vertigo-inducing detail. It's just stunning to look at. So, giving all that setup, how did you approach the composition to this one?
So, for me, as you said, the visuals are very striking, and you have this vertigo-inducing heights, but also these gigantic landscapes and structures. And for me, it's very atmospheric and a very emotionally potent film. It's really harrowing to watch, actually. So I wanted to highlight the grief that comes with corruption, and also the general sinister atmosphere that's happening, whilst also trying to allow the music to have a lot of space in it to reflect the space that is on film. So the techniques I used a lot of extended technique, a lot of texture in this regard, along with synthesizers as well. So it's an electroacoustic work, built upon less harmony and melody, but which I used much more in my previous films. In my previous films, there would be themes, there would be melodies for each character that I would harmonize differently depending on the context. And in this film, I scrapped a lot of that. And the context of that was also Aelita, which I think was more of a soundscape than a soundtrack. But this is very much a soundscape, because it is reflecting the environment and reflecting the atmosphere rather than reflecting details and characters. It's reflecting emotional landscapes essentially as well. So when you listen to it, you'll hear lots of tremolo, but also sol ponticello, and lots of sort of whisper tones on things, especially on the woodwinds, and these strange sounds of the brass instruments that all kind of sound just as if things aren't being played quite solidly. It kind of gives this raspy tone and these misty tones, I suppose, it's always hard to explain music. It's to create atmosphere. It's an intuitive thing that I was like, I think this would work.
Of course. Yeah. Wonderful. That sounds like a great moment for me to pop in a clip.
You're about to hear the track Climbing Oil Towers from Juliet's score for House on a Volcano. The film's director, Hamo Bek-Nazaryan, who is also often referred to by the Russified version of his surname, Bek-Nazarov, also came up in our episode on The Lighthouse by Armenian and Russian director Maria Sarkin. Well worth checking out that episode if you haven't already.
Thank you, Juliet, for that wonderful explanation. I love that description of using texture and creating these emotional landscapes. The score for House on a Volcano, for me, it reminds me of the scores by Johnny Greenwood. That use of as you were saying, like texture and doing stuff to the notes, and it's not always pretty sounding.
Yes, that's intentional, very much so.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I wondered whether Johnny Greenwood is a composer that you admired, or if not, kind of what informed that, like, to use a slightly lazy shorthand, like grittier approach to the soundscapes.
So actually one of my favorite composers is Lachman, and he really uses a lot of deconstructed techniques within his orchestras, and I gained a lot of inspiration from that, of these sort of not quite there sounds, or the instruments being played in an improper technique to create these, I guess, new sonic landscapes, let's call it that, because it really is less than about harmony and tradition and formalism in that regard, and much more about actual sound and texture, which I find fascinating. And that is what I have used here. I would say that was very much my inspiration.
I love it, and kind of exploring the possibility of instruments, and also maybe kind of blurring the boundary between score and essentially like Foley. Maybe, and it's kind of treating it as instead of like two separate bits, like one thing that binds together, and like it's not literally doing what Foley is doing of representing the sounds that are supposedly happening in the film, but using that to enhance the atmosphere and working together with the visuals to create those emotional landscapes. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is your comment about the use of space, because that to me seems like such a challenge to do, especially with silent films. It seems like the temptation would be to just because you've got all the space to want to fill all of it, but you really don't do that, and I love that because it's such a smart approach. I guess that's not really a question, that's more of a comment. Which isn't super helpful.
Well, I suppose let's kind of understand what you mean by space, because there's so much space that could happen. Are we talking about time space, in terms of we have these long scenes of where we have lots of location shots and shots of the constructions, or like construction equipment, or are we talking about quite literally the physical space of how huge they are? Because I think these all play a role in it, and actually there is quite a contrast within the film of close environments and larger environments, but still, even in the close environments, you could say that there's still a lot of space, because there's a lot of very idyllic shots of, children playing and just being in family homes. And I suppose I'm probably overanalyzing, but what is the opposite to space? I think maybe action is actually the opposite to space, of when you're highly focused on one central point, on language, on a particular action, that is consuming a lot of attention. in that way, I think the film is maybe nearly all space, apart from some off moments. And to fill that space, gosh, I mean, it would be disruptive to what is on screen to in a musical sense, to create music that is direct and requires a lot of attention. That would be music that takes up space, if you see what I mean. So in that way, I believe it's mirroring the visuals. It's not creating attention-seeking music, just as the visuals aren't attention-seeking, even though they're very wonderful to watch. I hope that makes sense.
No, that's brilliant, and I think that's what I was getting at with the space comment, is that you really allow the visuals to breathe, and yeah, it just creates that dynamics rather than just going, oh well, we better have lots of music all the way through, otherwise people are going to get bored. It's like, it's not that at all, because the visuals are so arresting that the amount of music can essentially it's dynamics, like dip in, dip out, like come to the fore. It has that really like complementary. The two are working together in, if you'll forgive the musical pun, in harmony. The two are enhancing what the other is doing. I actually watched it's drawing a blank on the name for a second. It is A New Babylon. That's the one. From, I think it's 1928 or 1929. So it's late silent film, and it has a Shostakovich score. Shostakovich, a very great artist. Absolutely. to quote the again, I'm drawing a blank on another film, Bridge of Spies. I love that film, but anyway, Shostakovich, a very great artist, but I would say the score in that film, there's lots that is brilliant about it, but he kind of doesn't know where to back off and let the visuals do the talking. So that is something that I think in the best silent scores, they get that balance right of like not worrying about being there too much, I guess, because that makes it sound like your soundtrack for House on a Volcano is super minimalist. I mean, it isn't. It's just I just loved it so much because it just so complimentary and enhanced the experience so much. And it's probably of the films you've scored, it's between that and Aelita as far as being my favourite, both of the films and of the scores. Really, I think there's a lot to do with my tastes, but it just works so well. Cool. Shall we talk a little bit about Aelita then? Because you kind of said that what you'd learned doing Aelita then informed your approach to House on a Volcano, if that's not putting words in your mouth.
Yes, well, I was going to say, actually, talking about, using Shostakovich in the film that you mentioned, Aelita's original soundtrack was actually a combination of music of Scriabin, Stravinsky, and Glazunov, which are both all of them, I mean, the best, some of the best composers that we have. It's unquestionable that their music is some might say transcendent, for those who are less spiritual, beautiful, and yes, but still somehow, as you said, in the original Aelita soundtrack, it's tiring to listen to, because these pieces that they put in are very, again, attention demanding, and that can be really tiring when you have things that you want to watch on screen and something else is also requiring your attention, essentially. So it doesn't allow for space in the way that we discussed before. And also, I feel that the music wasn't relevant as well, because it is traditional classicism, these very well constructed pieces to a sci-fi film. And whilst these pieces might engage with the emotional content of Aelita and potentially the action content, I don't think it actually engages with the aesthetic of Aelita, because they're just sort of two different time eras, it feels like. So I mean, this is the reason Klassiki, I've been working with Klassiki to modernize these films, to make these scores relevant and to make the film more understandable and to be more appealing to modern audiences, because otherwise I think without the excitement of cinema being a novelty, we've become a little bit numb to how wonderful this film would have been once upon a time when there had never been moving images in the first place. So we have to give the audience a little bit more nowadays to go, look how wonderful this is. Of course people know that, but imagine never ever having seen a moving image before in your life and it's there up on the screen. A modern audience can't actually experience that. So we want to bring something else that's interesting. And that's been what's been so fun. And talking about space and talking about being able to write whatever I want in that kind of regard, and having so much time space and action space and energy space, it's been really wonderful. And it's actually quite against tradition of score writing. Score writing is usually highly detailed and specific to the action on the screen. In some films, of course, that's a very specific thing, but this is very much not like that. Aelita was so much fun. I love working with electronics and synthesizers, mainly digital synthesizers, although I have recently had a lot of fun with analog synthesizers and have been learning a lot about them. But Aelita is generally only digital, but I've used around between 80 to 90 different sounds on this, and I've made it much more rhythmic than House on the Volcano. House on the Volcano, there's a time signature in there somewhere, I'm sure, but I mean, of course there is, but we don't feel that sense of pulse. In Aelita, there is a very definite sense of pulse. It's always progression, this moving forward, and sometimes this time like ticking, because it is, I guess, a sort of race. In my head it's very much mixed up, even though this was very much a different time, but sort of a race of technology, maybe a race to the moon. I know we haven't got there yet, but kind of in my head I know that's already coming, so maybe that's not very fair of me, but Aelita is on Mars. This is the future. It's building. We're kind of building up towards this very sci-fi world, and they're already predicting it here. So actually, when I say I'm referencing sort of 60s and 70s sci-fi genres in terms of soundtracks, that is actually very inaccurate, because of course this was created in the 1920s. But sort of being aware of that inaccuracy, I do think it brings a modernity to audiences in a way that they can relate a little bit more. I do not believe the sci-fi music genre was in any way formed in the 1920s. But hearing that more electronic-y sounds will bring people back to an understanding of a sci-fi genre that is much more accessible.
Yeah, I love it. I guess one could call it an intelligent or creative use of anachronism.
That's fair.
Kind of like to just play on contemporary audiences' associations and going like, yeah, this was made in the 1920s, but it's like prefigures or predicts a genre that wouldn't really be popularized in film till much later. I mean, in part just down to, filmmaking techniques and budgets and things like that.
And now we have the track Unite from Juliet's score for Aelita, Queen of Mars. We recently re-released our episode on Aelita with more music from Juliet, so that's well worth checking out if you haven't heard it already.
we should talk about the visuals of Aelita. Tell us about those, please.
Well, I believe it was one of the first Soviet sci-fi films ever made, and the visuals are stunning. I can't believe the amount of creativity that went into creating these sets. They are beautiful and enormous and detailed, and I truly think so much of our inspiration nowadays has come out from Aelita visually. The costume design, the sets, it's wonderful, and it's not cheesy sci-fi at all. Looking back at some sci-fi films now, it seems a little, because obviously we're in the future now, it seems a little cheesy, but Aelita gives a timeless sense of it just really, hard to explain, isn't cheesy. It genuinely feels futuristic in that sense, which is why I love it so much.
I don't know if I wholly agree on cheesiness. I mean, I feel like you could interpret it as cheesy in terms of the visuals, just because they're so bold. Like those costumes for our Martians, they're just so out there that they are almost, I mean, they are kind of funny, but they just also look great. It's the whole like Adam Ant line of like, ridicule is nothing to be scared of. It's just like, let's take a look and make it as bold as possible.
Yeah, for sure.
I cannot imagine wearing those costumes and trying to live a life, but maybe that's also part of the film's like commentary of like, these are like space aristocrats, so they don't need to be able to actually practically function because they have these legions of workers labouring on their behalf. But yeah, no, just such an amazing film, and again a score that totally complements that. Amazing. I appreciate we've talked about a lot of the films you've scored, not all. I think we're probably a little short on time, so perhaps to wrap up then, for listeners wanting to hear more of your work, where can they find that online?
Of course. So I would recommend just any of the music channels, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, they're all on there. Some new soundtracks have come out. I've been working on some new projects recently, which has been very fun. So there's some new stuff up there now. I have a screening in Oxford in November, and I will also be performing one of the film soundtracks in Italy in December, and there will be other things in between. If you want to watch any of the films, please go to the Klassiki website and you'll be able to find them all, with soundtracks included. So those are probably the main ways. And if you want to keep updated on anything that I'm doing, please go to my website and you will find all of the events that have been happening or will happen.
Amazing. I will put the links to all of those in the show notes to this episode. Thank you, Juliet, so much for your time and for a fascinating conversation. This has been so much fun, and I'm so glad that we finally did this.
Me too. It's been really wonderful to speak to you, so thank you for this. It's always good fun to discuss these things.
Thanks for listening to this episode of a Russian and Soviet movie podcast. To find out more about Juliet and her work, please go to julietmerchantmusic.com, where you'll also find links to her social media channels. Speaking of socials, if you're interested in getting some silent film recommendations from me, I have a Letterboxd list, which I'll be linking in the show notes. If you're on Letterboxd, you can find me on there at Ali_Pitts. Before I go, I also have a handful of podcast recommendations for you. First up, there's the Golden Silent Films podcast, hosted by Stuart Lee. One of the things I love about Stuart's show is its eclecticism. When you've been doing a movie podcast as long as I have, you get a sense of what the big movies are from each decade. In the case of the silent era, that's movies like Nosferatu, The Passion of Joan of Arc, or The Phantom Carriage. I love that Stuart switches between covering more famous ones like these and going off the beaten path and giving me even more new to me old films to add to the never-ending watch list. Secondly, and this is quite a recent discovery for me, is the Hipfest podcast. It's the show for a festival of silent films at the Hippodrome in Bowness, Scotland, which takes place in late March every year. A good starting point for that podcast would be their interview with Rachel Pronger, Camilla Bauer and Lauren Clark, who are members of the film archive activism collective Invisible Women. Rachel Pronger is a name you'll have heard on this show if you've caught the re-release of our episode on Aelita, as she's written about that film star Yulia Sontseva for the Klassiki journal. If you're interested in hearing me talk about a couple of silent films, please check out my appearance on Tim Coleman's The Top 100, which is a show that discusses the films in the 2022 Sight and Sound Critics Poll of the best films ever made. I was on there to talk about Dziga Vertov's masterpiece Man with a Movie Camera. There's also my guest spot on Dr. Sarah Ifdecker's show Media Evil, a medieval pop culture podcast, and I was on her episode on The Passion of Joan of Arc. Okay, links to all of those are in the show notes. If you've enjoyed the show, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss new episodes. Please leave us a positive rating or review, and please do recommend us to any friends who are into films or film history. Podcasting is an increasingly crowded field, as you'll know, and changes in social media algorithms in the last little while have made it more challenging for us to reach new listeners, so I'd really appreciate any support you can provide on this front. Alright, that's it from me for now. As always, take care, and do svidaniya, folks.